What would you do if you found out the love of your life cared more about your wealth than you? Nolan Everhart, a millionaire haunted by doubt, stages his own financial ruin to uncover the truth about his fiance's loyalty. But what he discovers will leave you speechless. And it doesn't stop there. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The Charleston Grand Hotel was alight with opulence, its grand ballroom transformed into a spectacle of glittering wealth and cultivated charm. Golden chandeliers cast their glow over the marble floors, where Charleston's elite mingled, their laughter and chatter weaving a symphony of affluence. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved like clockwork, balancing trays of champagne flutes that shimmered like liquid gold. Nolan Everhart stood at the edge of the room, his commanding presence impossible to ignore. At 42, he was the embodiment of success, a self-made millionaire who had transformed Everhart Enterprises into a real estate powerhouse. Dressed in a tailored black suit, his polished shoes gleaming under the lights, Nolan looked every bit the man who belonged here. Yet inside, he felt like an outsider. The glass in his hand felt heavier than it should. He swirled the champagne absently, watching the bubbles rise to the surface. The gala, hosted in his honor, was meant to celebrate the new waterfront development his company had spearheaded. But as he scanned the crowd, all he could see were masks, polished smiles, calculated gestures, and conversations that felt more like negotiations. "Nolan, darling," Celeste Manning's voice cut through his thoughts like silk. Turning, he saw her approaching, her emerald green gown flowing like water as she moved through the crowd. Celeste, 38, was magnetic, a woman who could command attention with a single glance. Her dark hair was swept elegantly to one side, exposing a pair of diamond earrings that sparkled as brightly as her carefully curated smile. "You've been hiding," she teased, wrapping her arm around his. Her touch was light, but the pressure of expectation was unmistakable. "This is your night. Everyone's here for you." "Is that so?" Nolan replied, his tone neutral. He glanced at her, taking in the way her eyes darted across the room, cataloging who was watching them. "You seem to be the one stealing the spotlight." Her laughter was soft, practiced. "Well, someone has to keep the conversation lively. You know how these events can be." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, dreadfully dull without a little charm. Nolan managed a faint smile but didn't respond. Celeste didn't notice, or if she did, she chose to ignore it. She gave his arm a squeeze before slipping away, leaving a trail of admirers in her wake. He watched as she glided effortlessly into another circle of guests, her laugh like the perfect melody to their rehearsed compliments. But then he heard it, a whisper carried on the tide of conversation. "She's got him wrapped around her finger," a man said, his voice just audible over the din. "Smart move, though. Locking down Everhart? That's a lifelong retirement plan." "I doubt she's in it for his sparkling personality," a woman added, her laugh sharp and biting. Nolan's grip on his champagne tightened. He turned away, the words settling like stones in his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd heard such things, but tonight, they hit differently. Maybe because deep down, he'd started to wonder if they were right. He stepped out onto the balcony, letting the cool night air wash over him. The Charleston skyline stretched out before him, the lights of the harbor twinkling in the distance. He leaned on the railing, loosening his tie as he exhaled a long breath. "You look like you've seen a ghost," a familiar voice drawled behind him. Turning, Nolan saw Walter Grayson leaning against the doorway. The older man, in his late 60s, was the very picture of Southern wisdom, gruff yet charming, with a lifetime of lessons etched into his lined face. Walter had been more than a mentor to Nolan. He was the voice of reason in a world that often felt unreasonable. "Walter," Nolan greeted, offering a faint smile, though the edges of his mouth barely curved upward. His voice held a mix of surprise and relief. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight. Galas aren't really your style." The older man stepped onto the balcony, the faint sound of his polished shoes tapping against the stone floor. "Couldn't resist," Walter replied, pulling a cigar from the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. He clipped the end with a practiced hand and lit it, the small flame flickering in the cool night air. He took a slow drag, exhaling a plume of smoke that curled around him. Besides, I had to check on my favorite student. Nolan chuckled softly, but the sound lacked warmth. He leaned against the railing, the cold metal grounding him. I think you'll find I've graduated, he said, his gaze fixed on the city lights shimmering in the distance. Walter arched a brow, the corners of his mouth twitching in a faint, knowing smile. Have you, though? His voice carried both humor and an edge of seriousness. Because, from where I'm standing, you look like a man who's still trying to figure out his lesson. Nolan didn't respond immediately. He tightened his grip on the railing, his jaw clenching slightly. The distant hum of the gala behind them felt like a world away, and for a moment he let the silence settle. Do you ever feel like none of this is real? He asked finally, his voice low but steady. Like everyone's just playing a part, waiting to see what they can take from you? Walter regarded him for a moment, his eyes sharp but understanding. He took another long drag from his cigar, letting the question hang in the air before he responded. That's the curse of success, son, he said, his voice roughened by years of experience. The higher you climb, the harder it is to tell who's holding the ladder and who's sawing it down. Nolan let out a short, humorless laugh, the sound carrying a bitterness he didn't bother to hide. You think I don't know that? Every handshake, every toast, every damn compliment feels like a transaction. But this, he turned, gesturing toward the ballroom, this is supposed to be different. She's supposed to be different. Walter's gaze didn't waver, the lines around his eyes deepening as he studied Nolan. It's Celeste, he said, not as a question but as a statement. Nolan nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. I don't know if she's with me because of me or because of what I have. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he quickly masked it with a cough. Walter's expression hardened, the humor fading from his features. He stepped closer, leaning on the railing beside Nolan. Then you've got a decision to make, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. You can spend the rest of your life wondering, or you can find out. Nolan turned his head sharply to face him, his brow furrowed. And how exactly am I supposed to do that? He asked, a hint of frustration bleeding into his voice. It's not like I can just ask her outright. Walter chuckled dryly, shaking his head. No, you can't. People lie, Nolan, even to themselves. He paused, his gaze drifting out over the city skyline. But if you want the truth, there's only one way to get it. Nolan raised a brow, his skepticism clear. And what's that? Walter met his gaze, his expression unreadable, except for the faintest hint of a challenge in his eyes. Take the money out of the equation, he said simply. Strip it all away and see what's left. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Nolan blinked, processing the weight of the suggestion. You're serious, he said after a moment, his voice quieter but no less incredulous. You want me to… what? Pretend to lose everything? Walter shrugged, taking another drag from his cigar. Call it what you want, a test, an experiment, whatever helps you sleep at night. But if you don't do it, you'll never know where her heart truly lies. And let me tell you something, son. He turned to face Nolan fully, his voice dropping to a near whisper. If you don't know that, you'll never be able to trust her or yourself. Nolan swallowed hard, the weight of Walter's words pressing against his chest. He looked away, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for an answer in the glittering lights of the city. It's a risk, he murmured, more to himself than to Walter. What if I'm wrong? Walter placed a firm hand on his shoulder, grounding him. Then you'll lose her. But if that's the case, maybe she wasn't yours to begin with. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truths. Walter gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. Think about it, he said, his voice softer now. But don't wait too long. Life's too short to waste on doubt. With that, Walter turned and walked back inside, the faint sound of his footsteps fading into the hum of the gala. Nolan stayed where he was, the cold railing biting into his palms as he gripped it tightly. The distant music and laughter felt hollow now, like a chorus of empty promises. When he finally re-entered the ballroom, Celeste was the first thing he saw. She was surrounded by a group of admirers, her laugh ringing out like a bell. She caught his eye and threw him a dazzling smile, the kind that had once made him feel like the luckiest man in the world. But now, it felt like a mask. Nolan's decision crystallized in that moment. If this was all a performance, it was time to see what happened when the curtain fell. Nolan sat in his expansive office on the 38th floor of the Everhart Enterprises building, the Charleston skyline sprawling outside his floor-to-ceiling windows. The room, with its sleek, modern design and air of quiet power, had always been a sanctuary, but today it felt like a prison. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the folder in front of him. Inside were the preliminary plans for what might be the most personal and daring move he'd ever made. Next to him, Esme Hartley, his trusted assistant, tapped away on her tablet. Esme was sharp, efficient, and fiercely loyal. At 30, she was the kind of woman who could navigate boardroom politics with the same ease she handled the logistics of Nolan's demanding schedule. Today, however, her usual composure was tinged with unease. "You're really going through with this?" she asked, finally looking up. Her hazel eyes narrowed as she studied his face. "Faking a financial crisis to test your fiancé's loyalty? You know how dangerous this could be." "I know," Nolan replied, his voice steady but his gaze distant. "But I need to know, Esme. I can't spend the rest of my life questioning if she's with me for the right reasons." Esme sighed, crossing her arms. "This isn't just about you, Nolan. You're talking about shaking the foundation of your entire company. What if the board gets wind of this? What if investors panic?" "They won't," Nolan said firmly. "We'll keep it contained. Just enough to create the illusion of instability. Rumors, a few strategic leaks, nothing concrete. The board will stay in the loop, and the investors will be reassured before things go too far." Esme raised a skeptical brow. "And Gerald's on board with this?" "He is," Nolan said. "Reluctantly." Almost on cue, the door opened, and Gerald Whitman entered. The company's CFO was in his mid-50s, with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that had seen Everhart Enterprises through countless challenges. Today, however, his expression was anything but calm. "I still think this is a terrible idea," Gerald said, dropping a stack of documents on Nolan's desk. "But since you're determined to do this, I've outlined how we can make it look plausible without setting off actual alarms. We're walking a razor's edge here, Nolan. One wrong step, and the fallout will be real." Nolan nodded, picking up the documents and skimming the first page. "I understand the risks, but this isn't just about the company, Gerald. It's about my future." Gerald sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you when this blows up in your face." As the two men discussed the finer details of the plan, Esme remained quiet, her fingers drumming lightly against her tablet. Finally, she broke the silence. "If we're doing this, we need to think about timing. When and how do you plan to tell Celeste?" "I'll wait until the rumors start to spread," Nolan replied. "I want to see her unfiltered reaction. If she's truly with me for who I am, she'll stand by me. If not," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. Esme leaned back in her chair, her skepticism giving way to a faint hint of sympathy. "I just hope you're ready for whatever you find out." That evening, after hours of poring over the plan, Nolan left the office earlier than usual. His mind was heavy with the weight of what he was about to set in motion. He drove aimlessly through Charleston's historic streets, the cobblestone roads and gaslit lanterns a stark contrast to the modern world he usually inhabited. As he turned a corner, his attention was caught by a small cafe nestled between two larger storefronts. Its warm glow stood out against the chilly evening, and a handwritten sign in the window read, "Savvy's Cafe, fresh pastries and hot coffee." Nolan pulled over on a whim, drawn by the simplicity of the place. Inside, the cafe was cozy and inviting, with mismatched furniture and the faint scent of vanilla and cinnamon lingering in the air. A handful of customers sat scattered at tables, chatting quietly or working on laptops. Behind the counter stood Savannah Carter. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her hands moved deftly as she poured a steaming latte. She wore an apron over a simple sweater and jeans, her appearance as unassuming as the cafe itself. "Hi there," Savannah greeted as Nolan approached the counter. Her voice was warm, her southern accent soft but noticeable. "What can I get for you?" Nolan hesitated, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his tailored suit. "Just a black coffee, please." "Coming right up," Savannah said with a smile. She moved with practiced ease, her hands steady as she prepared his order. When she handed him the cup, their eyes met briefly. There was no flicker of recognition, no attempt to place him as Nolan Everhart, the millionaire developer. She saw him only as a customer. "First time here?" Savannah asked, leaning lightly on the counter. "Yeah," Nolan replied, taking a sip of his coffee. It was rich and smooth, a pleasant surprise. "I didn't even know this place existed." Savannah laughed softly. "We're a little off the beaten path, but that's kind of the charm. Keeps things quiet." Nolan nodded, glancing around the room. "It's nice. Feel real." Her brow furrowed slightly as if sensing something deeper in his words, but she didn't press. "Glad you like it. Let me know if you need anything else." As Nolan sat at a small table near the window, he found himself watching Savannah as she worked. There was something about her, a calmness, a groundedness, that felt foreign but comforting. She didn't seem rushed or preoccupied, despite the steady stream of customers. Every smile she offered was genuine, every word spoken with intention. For the first time in days, Nolan felt the tension in his chest ease. The cafe, with its warmth and simplicity, was a world away from the high-stakes life he had grown accustomed to. And Savannah, though he barely knew her, seemed like the kind of person who understood what truly mattered. As he finished his coffee and prepared to leave, Savannah called out, "Thanks for stopping by. Hope to see you again." Nolan paused at the door, turning back to offer her a small smile. "You just might." As he stepped out into the crisp night air, he realized something. The plan he was about to set in motion wasn't just a test for Celeste, it was a test for himself. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope that, no matter the outcome, he might finally find what he'd been searching for. The morning headlines spread like wildfire across Charleston's business community. Everhart Enterprises facing unprecedented challenges. Real estate titan Nolan Everhart on shaky ground? Nolan stood at his kitchen counter, a steaming mug of coffee in hand as he scanned the article on his tablet. The staged leaks had done their job. Anonymous sources had planted seeds of doubt, and now speculation about Everhart Enterprises' financial stability was making waves. The first domino had fallen. His phone buzzed on the marble countertop. It was Celeste. Her name lingered on the screen, the faint vibration echoing in the quiet room. Nolan hesitated for a moment before answering. "Good morning, Celeste." "What's going on, Nolan?" Her voice carried an edge, concern mingling with something sharper. "I woke up to half a dozen calls about this article. Are you really in trouble?" "It's complicated," Nolan replied, keeping his tone even. "The market's shifting, and some projects aren't performing as expected. We're looking at a few restructuring options." "Restructuring?" Celeste repeated, her voice tightening. "That sounds serious." "It's not as bad as it sounds," Nolan lied, pacing the kitchen. "I didn't want to worry you until I had a better handle on things." There was a pause on the line, long enough for Nolan to hear the faint sound of her nails tapping against something hard. Finally, she said, "I wish you'd told me sooner. I could have helped, somehow." Nolan's lips pressed into a thin line. Her words were supportive, but the hesitation in her voice was impossible to ignore. "I appreciate that," he said, though the words felt hollow. "I'll keep you updated." When the call ended, Nolan set the phone down and exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what he had expected, outright panic perhaps, but her reaction left him uneasy. The cracks in her composure were subtle, but they were there. Later that afternoon, Nolan found himself drawn back to Savannah's cafe. The news had made its way into every corner of his life, and he needed a place where he wasn't Nolan Everhart, the embattled millionaire. Just Nolan. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and Savannah looked up from the counter. Her face lit up with a smile that, for once, felt like more than just polite acknowledgement. "Back so soon?" she teased. "You must really like my coffee." "It's not bad," Nolan replied, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips as he approached the counter. "What'll it be today?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. "The usual?" "Actually, Nolan hesitated, glancing at the chalkboard menu. Surprise me. Savannah chuckled. Risk taker, huh? I like it. As she prepared his drink, Nolan took a seat near the window. The cafe was quieter than it had been during his last visit, the hum of conversation replaced by the faint sound of soft jazz playing through the speakers. It was a small haven of normalcy in a world that suddenly felt unsteady. When Savannah brought over his drink, a cappuccino with a swirl of caramel, she lingered for a moment, her curiosity evident. You seem distracted, she said, her tone careful. Everything okay? Nolan hesitated. He wasn't used to people asking about his well-being without an agenda. Just work stuff, he said finally, taking a sip of the cappuccino. It was warm and comforting, much like the space around him. Savannah nodded, not pressing further. Instead, she leaned lightly on the back of the chair across from him. Well, whatever it is, I hope it works out. You don't strike me as the kind of guy who lets things fall apart easily. Nolan glanced up at her, surprised by her candor. That's kind of you to say. Just being honest, she replied with a shrug. Life's messy, but that doesn't mean it's all bad. Her words lingered with him long after she returned to the counter. Over the next few days, the news continued to ripple through Charleston's social circles. Nolan began to notice a shift in Celeste's demeanor. She was still attentive, but her questions grew more pointed. How bad is it really? She asked one evening as they sat in his living room. She wore a sleek black dress, her makeup flawless as always, but there was a tension in her posture. It's manageable, Nolan replied, setting his glass of scotch on the coffee table. We've hit a rough patch before. We'll come out of it. Celeste tilted her head, studying him. And if you don't? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Nolan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then I'll rebuild, he said simply. Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm sure you will, she murmured, leaning back into the couch. But the distance between them felt more pronounced than ever. Meanwhile, Savannah's cafe became a sanctuary for Nolan. He found himself stopping by more frequently, drawn not just by the coffee, but by the unassuming warmth of the place. Each visit felt like a small reprieve from the storm he had created. One evening, as he sat at his usual table, Savannah approached with a plate of cookies. On the house, she said, setting it down with a grin. You look like you could use something sweet. Do I? Nolan asked, raising an eyebrow. Maybe just a little, she teased, sitting down across from him. So, mystery man, what is it you actually do? You've been here almost every day this week, but I can't quite figure you out. Nolan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I'm in real estate, he said vaguely. Savannah smirked. Real estate, huh? That explains the suit. Guilty, Nolan said, smiling faintly. What about you? Always wanted to run a cafe? Pretty much, Savannah said, her expression softening. It's not glamorous, but it's mine. And I like seeing people come in, slow down, and just be. Her words struck a chord with Nolan. He envied the simplicity of her life, the sense of purpose that seemed so effortless. Well, for what it's worth, you've created something special here, he said sincerely. Thanks, Savannah replied, her smile genuine. That means a lot. As they chatted, Nolan felt a strange sense of ease, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Savannah's world was so different from his, yet it felt like a place he could belong. As the cafe began to wind down for the night, Nolan glanced at his phone. A text from Celeste flashed on the screen. We need to talk. He stared at it for a moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. For now, he wasn't ready to leave the calm of Savannah's cafe. Not yet. The city buzzed with speculation, Everhart Enterprises dominating the business pages. Nolan felt the weight of every glance, every hushed conversation as he walked into the office each morning. Yet despite the controlled chaos, his team remained steady. His assistant Esme was unshakable, and Gerald's careful hand on the financial reins kept the company afloat. But the tension at home was a different story. At first, Celeste had been attentive. She asked probing questions about the company's state and assured him she believed in his ability to turn things around. But Nolan couldn't ignore the subtle shift in her tone, the clipped edges of her words, the way she avoided eye contact when the subject of their future came up. One evening, over a quiet dinner at Nolan's penthouse, the distance became undeniable. Celeste sat across from him, her perfectly manicured hands idly playing with the stem of her wineglass. The glow of the city lights filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. "You've been quiet lately," Nolan said, breaking the silence. Celeste looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "I've been thinking," she said after a pause, "about us, about everything." Nolan set his fork down, his appetite suddenly gone. "And what have you decided?" Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I think we need to be realistic about what's happening. If things don't improve, if the company can't recover, what does that mean for us?" The question hit like a cold slap, but Nolan kept his expression calm. "What do you think it means?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft but laced with tension. "But I think we should start preparing for the possibility that things might change." Nolan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "And by things, you mean our lifestyle." Celeste bristled slightly, her composure faltering. "This isn't just about me, Nolan. I'm trying to be practical. You have to admit, it's a lot to take on." He didn't respond right away, his mind racing. The doubts that had been simmering beneath the surface now felt undeniable. Celeste was already pulling away, hedging her bets in case his fall became permanent. "I appreciate your honesty," Nolan said finally, his tone measured. "But I have to wonder, how much of this is about practicality and how much is about fear?" Celeste's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and hurt, but she didn't respond. Instead, she pushed her chair back and stood. "I need some air," she said curtly, grabbing her coat and disappearing out the door before he could say another word. The next morning, Nolan sought refuge in the familiarity of Savannah's cafe. The place had become a lifeline, its warmth and simplicity offering a stark contrast to the strained opulence of his life with Celeste. Savannah greeted him with her usual smile, though there was a hint of curiosity in her gaze. "You've been looking more stressed than usual," she said, as she handed him his coffee. "Everything okay?" Nolan chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Define okay." Savannah leaned on the counter, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes when everything feels like it's falling apart, it's just clearing the way for something better." He raised an eyebrow, surprised by her insight. "That sounds suspiciously optimistic." She shrugged, smiling. "I guess I've had to be. Life doesn't always give you what you want, but it has a way of giving you what you need. Eventually." Nolan nodded, her words lingering with him as he took a seat by the window. From his spot, he could see Savannah moving effortlessly between customers, her presence a quiet but constant reassurance. As he watched her, another figure caught his attention. A man in a tailored suit, Declan Royce, the CEO of a rival real estate firm, and someone Nolan had clashed with more than once in the past. Declan was leaning casually against the counter, his attention fixed on Savannah. Nolan's jaw tightened as he observed the interaction. Savannah seemed polite but distant, her body language signaling discomfort. Declan, however, was persistent, his grin widening with every word he spoke. When Declan finally left, Savannah approached Nolan's table, her smile more forced than usual. "Anything else I can get you?" "Is everything okay?" Nolan asked, his voice low. Savannah hesitated, then sighed. "That guy, Declan, right? He's been showing up a lot lately. Says he's interested in buying the building, but I think he's just trying to rattle me." Nolan frowned. "Buying the building? Does he have the authority to do that?" "I don't know," Savannah admitted, her frustration evident. "The landlord hasn't mentioned anything, but Declan likes to act like he owns the place already." Nolan's chest tightened. Declan's presence here wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. He'd always been an opportunist, and with Nolan's supposed financial troubles in the headlines, it wouldn't be surprising if Declan saw this as a chance to gain leverage. "Let me know if he comes back," Nolan said firmly. "And if he gives you any trouble, call me." Savannah tilted her head, her expression softening. "You're really invested in this, huh?" Nolan met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "Let's just say I don't like seeing good people get pushed around." Meanwhile, Celeste's priorities continued to shift. That evening, Nolan returned to his penthouse to find her gone, A brief note left on the counter. Staying with a friend for a few days. Need some space. He stared at the note, a dull ache settling in his chest. It wasn't unexpected, but it still hurt. And yet part of him felt a strange sense of relief. If Celeste needed space, maybe it was time he admitted he did too. As the days passed, Nolan threw himself into his work, preparing for the next phase of his plan. But in the quiet moments, he found his thoughts drifting more and more to Savannah. Her resilience, her kindness, the way she made him feel like he could breathe again. The lines between his test for Celeste and his own journey of self-discovery were beginning to blur. And while the cracks in his relationship with Celeste grew deeper, the connection he felt with Savannah was starting to feel like something he couldn't ignore. Nolan chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. Define okay. Savannah leaned on the counter, her expression thoughtful. Sometimes when everything feels like it's falling apart, it's just clearing the way for something better. He raised an eyebrow, surprised by her insight. That sounds suspiciously optimistic. She shrugged, smiling. I guess I've had to be. Life doesn't always give you what you want, but it has a way of giving you what you need, eventually. Nolan nodded, her words lingering with him as he took a seat by the window. From his spot, he could see Savannah moving effortlessly between customers, her presence a quiet but constant reassurance. As he watched her, another figure caught his attention. A man in a tailored suit, Declan Royce, the CEO of a rival real estate firm and someone Nolan had clashed with more than once in the past. Declan was leaning casually against the counter, his attention fixed on Savannah. Nolan's jaw tightened as he observed the interaction. Savannah seemed polite but distant, her body language signaling discomfort. Declan, however, was persistent, his grin widening with every word he spoke. When Declan finally left, Savannah approached Nolan's table, her smile more forced than usual. Anything else I can get you? Is everything okay? Nolan asked, his voice low. Savannah hesitated, then sighed. That guy, Declan, right? He's been showing up a lot lately. Says he's interested in buying the building, but I think he's just trying to rattle me. Nolan frowned. Buying the building? Does he have the authority to do that? I don't know, Savannah admitted, her frustration evident. The landlord hasn't mentioned anything, but Declan likes to act like he owns the place already. Nolan's chest tightened. Declan's presence here wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. He'd always been an opportunist, and with Nolan's supposed financial troubles in the headlines, it wouldn't be surprising if Declan saw this as a chance to gain leverage. Let me know if he comes back, Nolan said firmly. And if he gives you any trouble, call me. Savannah tilted her head, her expression softening. You're really invested in this, huh? Nolan met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Let's just say I don't like seeing good people get pushed around. Meanwhile, Celeste's priorities continued to shift. That evening, Nolan returned to his penthouse to find her gone, a brief note left on the counter. Staying with a friend for a few days, need some space. He stared at the note, a dull ache settling in his chest. It wasn't unexpected, but it still hurt. And yet, part of him felt a strange sense of relief. If Celeste needed space, maybe it was time he admitted he did too. As the days passed, Nolan threw himself into his work, preparing for the next phase of his plan. But in the quiet moments, he found his thoughts drifting more and more to Savannah. Her resilience, her kindness, the way she made him feel like he could breathe again. The lines between his test for Celeste and his own journey of self-discovery were beginning to blur. And while the cracks in his relationship with Celeste grew deeper, the connection he felt with Savannah was starting to feel like something he couldn't ignore. The late autumn sun hung low in the Charleston sky, casting long, golden shadows across Nolan's office. He stood by the window, his back to the room as he stared out at the bustling city below. The financial rumors surrounding Everhart Enterprises had reached a fever pitch, and though his team worked tirelessly to manage the fallout, the strain was beginning to show. The knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice steady but tired. Esme stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She carried her ever-present tablet, her expression grim. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. Just one? Nolan quipped dryly, turning to face her. This one's personal, Esme replied, setting the tablet on his desk and sliding it toward him. On the screen was a series of photos, grainy but clear enough to identify the figures. Nolan's chest tightened as he recognized Celeste sitting across from Declan Royce at an upscale restaurant. The timestamp was from the night before. She's meeting with him? Nolan's voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. It looks that way, Esme said. And from what I've gathered, Declan has been sniffing around more than just your company. He's also targeting someone close to you. Who? Nolan demanded, his tone sharp. Esme hesitated before answering. Savannah Carter. He's been making inquiries about her cafe and the building it's in. My guess is he's using her as leverage, or as a way to get under your skin. Nolan's jaw tightened. Declan's reputation as a ruthless competitor was well known, but this crossed a line. Keep digging, he said, his voice low but firm. I want to know exactly what he's planning. Later that day, Nolan walked into Savannah's cafe, the familiar scent of coffee and cinnamon offering a brief respite from the chaos of his world. Savannah was behind the counter, chatting with a customer, her smile as warm as the sunlight streaming through the windows. When she saw him, her expression brightened. Back again? She teased as he approached the counter. You're starting to make me think you're hiding from something. Maybe I am, Nolan replied, managing a faint smile. Do you have a minute to talk? Savannah glanced around the cafe. It was a quiet afternoon, with only a few patrons scattered across the tables. Sure, she said, stepping out from behind the counter. What's on your mind? Nolan hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Has anyone been bothering you lately? He asked finally. Anyone asking questions about the cafe? Or the building? Savannah's brow furrowed. You mean Declan? He's been around a couple of times talking about wanting to buy the property, but I didn't think much of it. Why? Nolan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He's not just interested in the property, Savannah. He's using it to get to me. Her eyes widened in surprise. To you? Why would he? It's complicated, Nolan interrupted gently. But I want you to know that if he gives you any trouble, you can call me. I'll handle it. Savannah crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. I appreciate the concern, but I've been handling trouble long before you walked in here. I don't need a knight in shining armor. I'm not trying to be a knight, Nolan said, his tone softening. I just don't want to see you caught in the crossfire. Savannah studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his. Finally, she nodded. All right, but don't think this means I can't fight my own battles. Noted, Nolan said with a faint smile. That evening, Nolan returned to his penthouse, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and the picture they formed was far from reassuring. Declan was targeting both his company and the people he cared about, and Celeste's involvement, whether deliberate or incidental, only added fuel to the fire. As he poured himself a drink, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Esme. I have more info. Call me. Nolan dialed her number immediately. What did you find? He asked as soon as she picked up. Declan's been meeting with Celeste regularly, Esme said, and from what I've learned, he's been feeding her information, planting doubts about your ability to recover from this supposed financial crisis. It's no coincidence she's been pulling away. Nolan closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on his shoulders. And Savannah? Nothing concrete yet, Esme said. But I wouldn't be surprised if Declan starts putting pressure on her soon. He's trying to rattle you, Nolan, and it looks like it's working. Not for long, Nolan said, his voice hardening. I'm going to put an end to this. The next day, Declan made his move. Savannah called Nolan in a panic, her usually steady voice trembling. Nolan, he's here, she said. Declan's at the cafe, and he's telling me the landlord is ready to sell the building. I don't know if it's true, but I'm on my way, Nolan said, grabbing his keys. When he arrived, Declan was leaning against the counter, his smug grin making Nolan's blood boil. Savannah stood on the other side, her arms crossed defensively. Declan, Nolan said sharply, drawing the man's attention. Nolan, Declan replied, his tone mockingly cheerful. Fancy seeing you here. Whatever you're doing, it stops now, Nolan said, stepping closer. Declan's grin widened. Relax. I'm just exploring opportunities. Nothing personal. It's personal to me, Nolan said, his voice low but firm. Leave her out of this. Declan's expression darkened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pushed off the counter and gave Savannah a mocking bow. Pleasure doing business, he said before walking out. Savannah turned to Nolan, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and confusion. What the hell was that about? It's a long story, Nolan said, but I promise, I'll make sure he doesn't bother you again. You'd better, Savannah said, her tone sharper than usual, because I won't let anyone take this place from me. As she walked away, Nolan felt a pang of guilt. His test for Celeste had spiraled into something far more complicated, and now Savannah was caught in the middle. He vowed to set things right, but he knew the road ahead would only get harder. The following evening, Nolan sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls around him. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of unanswered questions and rising tensions. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass absent-mindedly, replaying the events of the past few days. Declan's threats, Celeste's distance, and Savannah's defiance all swirled in his mind like a storm he couldn't escape. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Celeste. I'm coming over. We need to talk. Nolan's jaw tightened. The words felt ominous, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever conversation awaited him would be a turning point. An hour later, Celeste arrived, dressed impeccably in a tailored blazer and heels that clicked sharply against the floor as she entered. Her expression was guarded, her usual confidence replaced by something more uncertain. Thank you for seeing me, she said, her voice unusually soft. Nolan gestured for her to sit, but he remained standing, his arms crossed as he watched her. What's on your mind? Celeste hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her designer bag. I wanted to clear the air, she began, her voice steadying. I know things have been tense between us lately. Tense? Nolan echoed, raising an eyebrow. Is that what you'd call it? She looked away, exhaling sharply. Nolan, I'm trying, but this situation with the company, it's not what I expected. I need to know where we stand. Nolan's eyes narrowed. Where we stand, or where the company stands? Celeste flinched, but quickly recovered. That's not fair. Isn't it? Nolan pressed, his tone sharp. Because from where I'm standing, it feels like you're more concerned about the fallout than about me. That's not true, she insisted, her voice rising. But I can't ignore what's happening, Nolan. You're not just some guy trying to make ends meet. You're Nolan Everhart, and if this company falls apart, it's not just your name on the line, it's mine too. There it was, laid bare in her words. Nolan felt a pang of disappointment, though it was tempered by the bitter satisfaction of finally having confirmation. So it's about your image, he said coldly. Celeste stood abruptly, her eyes flashing with anger. Don't you dare make me the villain here. Do you think it's easy for me, watching everything we've built together unravel? We, Nolan interrupted, his voice like steel. What exactly have you built, Celeste? Because from where I'm standing, it feels like you've only been here for the perks. Her mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she turned away, her shoulders tense. I don't have to take this, she said finally, grabbing her bag and heading toward the door. Before she could leave, Nolan's voice stopped her. Celeste. She turned, her expression a mix of frustration and desperation. What? Be honest with me, just this once, Nolan said, his tone softer now. If I lost everything tomorrow, if there were no penthouse, no company, no headlines, would you still be here? The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Celeste's lips parted, but the silence that followed was answer enough. I thought so, Nolan said quietly, turning away as she walked out the door, without another word. The next morning, Nolan found himself at Savannah's cafe, seeking solace in the only place that still felt real. Savannah was behind the counter, her hair pulled back in a messy bun as she chatted with a regular. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that felt like a balm on his frayed nerves. Rough night? She asked as he approached. You could say that, Nolan replied, his voice heavy with fatigue. Savannah handed him his usual coffee and gestured to the seat by the window. Take a load off. I'll join you in a minute. True to her word, Savannah slid into the seat across from him a few minutes later, a cup of tea in her hands. "So," she said, leaning forward slightly, "want to talk about it? Or should I just sit here and pretend not to notice how stressed you look?" Nolan chuckled softly, the sound more genuine than he'd expected. "I'll spare you the long version," he said. "Let's just say I learned some hard truths last night." Savannah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Truths are funny like that," she said. "They hurt, but they're necessary." He studied her, marveling at how effortlessly she seemed to cut through the noise in his life. "Do you ever feel like the people around you only see what they want to see? Like they're more interested in what you can offer than who you are?" "All the time," Savannah said, surprising him with the immediacy of her response. "When I first opened this place, people didn't take me seriously. They thought I was just some single mom with a hobby, but I didn't care. I knew why I was doing it, and that was enough." Her words resonated deeply with Nolan, and for a moment he felt a sense of clarity. "You're a lot stronger than you give yourself credit for," he said. Savannah shrugged, her smile soft. "You don't need strength until life gives you a reason to need it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the hum of the cafe filling the spaces between their words. For the first time in weeks, Nolan felt like he could breathe. As he left the cafe later that morning, Savannah's parting words echoed in his mind. Real love doesn't need conditions. It just is. That afternoon, Esme called with an update. "We've got the proof," she said. "Declan's been falsifying records and siphoning funds from his own company. It's only a matter of time before it all comes crashing down." "Good," Nolan said. "Let's make sure he's too busy dealing with his own mess to bother us again." As he hung up, Nolan realized that while the fight for his company was far from over, the real battle was happening within himself. The staged financial collapse, the test for Celeste, all of it had forced him to confront what truly mattered. And as he looked out over the city from his office, one thing became clear. His future didn't lie in the superficial world he'd spent so long building. It lay in something far more real and far more fragile. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of salt from Charleston Harbor as Nolan stepped into Everhart Enterprises. The usually bustling office felt unusually subdued, the weight of recent weeks casting a long shadow. Yet there was a quiet determination in Nolan's stride as he made his way to the conference room where Esme and Gerald were waiting. Esme stood at the head of the table, her tablet in hand, while Gerald leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his usual no-nonsense demeanor firmly in place. On the table between them was a folder containing the evidence they'd gathered on Declan Royce. "This is it," Esme said, sliding the folder toward Nolan. "Everything we need to expose him." Nolan opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. The proof was damning. Falsified financial statements, diverted funds, and emails outlining Declan's schemes to sabotage Everhart Enterprises. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "This is worse than I thought." Gerald nodded grimly. "The man's been playing a dangerous game for years. He's not just after your company. He's built his entire career on deceit. Taking him down won't just protect Everhart. It'll expose him for who he really is." Nolan closed the folder, his mind racing. "We'll leak this to the right people. Let his downfall be his own doing. But I want to make sure Savannah's safe first." Esme raised an eyebrow. "You think Declan will retaliate?" "He's desperate," Nolan said. "And desperate men do stupid things." That afternoon, Nolan drove to Savannah's cafe, his chest tightening as he approached the familiar brick building. Inside, the cafe buzzed with its usual warmth, the hum of conversation and the scent of freshly baked pastries creating a stark contrast to the turmoil Nolan carried with him. Savannah was at the counter, laughing with a regular as she handed over a steaming cup of coffee. When she saw Nolan, her smile widened, and she waved him over. "Twice in one day," she teased as he approached. "You're either becoming a caffeine addict or you just really like my company." "Both," Nolan admitted with a faint smile. "Do you have a minute?" Savannah's smile faltered slightly as she caught the seriousness in his tone. "Let me grab Ivy, and we can sit down." She disappeared into the back room and returned with her young daughter Ivy in tow. The little girl clutched a coloring book and crayons, her bright eyes lighting up when she saw Nolan. "Hi, Mr. Nolan." Ivy chirped, sliding into a chair at the table Savannah gestured to. Hi, Ivy, Nolan replied, his tone softening. How's the coloring coming along? I'm making a rainbow, Ivy announced proudly, holding up a page filled with bright streaks of color. Savannah chuckled, ruffling her daughter's hair before sitting across from Nolan. Okay, she said, her tone more serious now. What's going on? Nolan hesitated, unsure of how much to share. There's something you need to know about Declan, he began. He's been targeting me, and by extension, you. Savannah frowned, leaning forward. What do you mean? He's been trying to rattle me using your cafe as leverage, Nolan explained, but we've uncovered evidence that proves he's been involved in some serious fraud. Once we expose him, he won't be a threat anymore. Savannah's eyes narrowed. And in the meantime, what's stopping him from causing more trouble? I'll make sure he doesn't, Nolan said firmly. You and Ivy are safe, Savannah. I promise. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his. You're really putting yourself on the line for this, she said finally. Why? Nolan hesitated, the weight of his answer pressing against him. Because I care, he admitted. About you, about Ivy, and because you've reminded me of what's important. Savannah's expression softened, and for a moment, the chaos of the world outside seemed to fade. Thank you, Nolan, she said quietly, for everything. As the day turned into evening, Nolan found himself lingering at the cafe, helping Savannah clean up after the last customer left. Ivy had fallen asleep on one of the couches, her coloring book still clutched in her hands. You didn't have to stay, Savannah said as she wiped down the counter, but I'm glad you did. I didn't want to leave, Nolan admitted, his voice low. This place, it feels like home. Savannah paused, her hands stilling as she looked at him. You don't strike me as someone who's ever lacked a home. Not a physical one, Nolan said, but a real one? That's different. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the unspoken connection between them felt stronger than ever. But before either of them could say more, Nolan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Esme. It's done. Declan's downfall is in motion. The next morning, the news broke. Declan Royce's fraudulent practices were exposed, and the fallout was swift. His company's stock plummeted, and investors pulled out, and legal action loomed on the horizon. Nolan watched the headlines roll in from his office, a quiet sense of vindication settling over him. But even as Declan's empire crumbled, Nolan's thoughts were elsewhere. He thought of Savannah and Ivy, of the quiet strength they had shown in the face of uncertainty. And he thought of himself, of the man he was becoming, shaped not by his wealth, but by the people who had shown him what truly mattered. For the first time in a long while, Nolan felt like he was picking up the pieces of his life in a way that mattered. And as he looked out over the Charleston skyline, he knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. The Charleston air was heavy with the aftermath of Declan Royce's fall. Headlines splashed his disgrace across every major business outlet, painting Nolan Everhart as the architect of justice. But despite the vindication, Nolan's focus was elsewhere. His growing connection with Savannah and her daughter Ivy had become a source of solace, a bright spot in a life otherwise consumed by chaos. That evening, Nolan returned to his penthouse after a long day at the office. The space felt emptier than ever, its modern design cold and impersonal. He loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of scotch, the silence of the room settling over him like a weight. He was about to sit down when the intercom buzzed. Mr. Everhart, there's someone here to see you, the doorman said. Who is it? Nolan asked, his tone sharper than he intended. She says her name is Celeste. Nolan's hand tightened around the glass. He hesitated for a moment before responding. Send her up. When the elevator doors opened, Celeste stepped out, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was as impeccably dressed as ever, her makeup flawless, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes Nolan hadn't seen before. Celeste, he said evenly, what are you doing here? I needed to see you, she replied, her voice soft. After everything that's happened, I couldn't stay away. Nolan crossed his arms, leaning against the back of the couch. I'm surprised. You made it pretty clear where you stood. She winced, her composure faltering. I know I hurt you, Nolan, and I know I let my fear get in the way, but I've had time to think, And I realize now, I made a mistake. Nolan's jaw tightened. What kind of mistake? I gave up too easily, she admitted, stepping closer. When things got tough, I should have stood by you. Instead, I let my doubts take over. But I still care about you, Nolan. I still believe in us. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Nolan felt the faint pull of what they had once shared. But the memory of her hesitation, her willingness to abandon ship when things got rocky, was still fresh in his mind. Why now, Celeste? He asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Because Declan's out of the picture? Because the company's on stable ground again? She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. Number because I realized what I was losing. You. I don't care about the money or the company. I care about you. Nolan stared at her, his emotions a tumultuous mix of anger, sadness, and something he couldn't quite name. Words are easy, Celeste, he said quietly. But actions? Those tell a different story. The next day, Nolan found himself back at Savannah's cafe. The place was bustling, the cheerful energy a stark contrast to the weight he carried. Savannah greeted him with her usual smile, though there was a hint of something guarded in her eyes. Busy morning? He asked as he approached the counter. Always, she replied with a laugh. But it's a good kind of busy. Nolan ordered his usual and took a seat near the window, watching as Savannah moved effortlessly between customers. When she finally had a moment to breathe, she joined him at the table, wiping her hands on a towel. You look like you've got a lot on your mind, she said, her tone light but probing. Nolan hesitated, unsure of how much to share. Celeste came back, he said finally. Savannah's expression didn't change, but he noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. And? She wants another chance, Nolan admitted, swirling the coffee in his mug. She says she made a mistake, that she still cares. And what do you think? Savannah asked, her voice carefully neutral. I think... Nolan paused, searching for the right words. I think I don't know if I can trust her, but part of me feels like I owe it to myself to hear her out. Savannah nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the table. It sounds like you have a lot to figure out. Her words were simple, but Nolan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unspoken beneath them. Savannah, he said softly, what about us? She looked up at him, her expression pained. Nolan, I don't want to be someone's second choice, and I don't want to compete with your past. You need to figure out what you want, without me in the equation. The honesty in her words hit him like a punch to the gut. That's not what this is, he said, his voice firm. You're not a second choice. But it feels like I am, Savannah said, standing. And I can't do that to myself or to Ivy. I need to protect what's important to me. Nolan watched as she walked away, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he realized that his indecision was hurting more than just himself. And as he left the cafe, a heavy sense of urgency settled over him. He couldn't let this be the end, not with Savannah, not with the life he was beginning to see beyond the shadows of his past. Nolan sat alone in the corner of a quiet wine bar, the rich, earthy scent of oak barrels mixing with the faint hum of jazz in the background. A glass of Merlot sat untouched on the table in front of him, its deep red color reflecting the low golden light. He stared at the empty chair across from him, a metaphorical representation of the void in his life. The choice before him weighed heavily on his chest. On one side was Celeste, pleading for a second chance, and on the other was Savannah, stepping back to protect herself and her daughter. For the first time in his life, Nolan didn't know which path to take, and the uncertainty was suffocating. Mind if I join you? Nolan looked up to see Lydia, his older sister, standing by the table. Her tailored pantsuit was as sharp as ever, but her expression was softer than usual. Without waiting for an answer, she slid into the chair across from him and gestured to the waiter. Let me guess, Lydia said, her tone wry. You've got that "I've ruined everything" look again. Nolan huffed a soft laugh, shaking his head. I didn't invite you here for a lecture. Good thing I don't need an invitation, Lydia replied, her smile faint but teasing. You called me because you need someone to help you figure out what's going on in that overcomplicated head of yours. She wasn't wrong. Lydia had always been his sounding board, the one person who could cut through his defenses and make him confront the truth he didn't want to see. It's about Celeste and Savannah, Nolan admitted after a pause. I feel like I'm standing at a crossroads and no matter which way I turn, someone's going to get hurt. Lydia leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes studying him. All right, let's break this down. What does Celeste bring to your life? Nolan frowned, swirling the wine in his glass. History, I guess. Familiarity. But there's also doubt, questions about her motives that I can't shake. And Savannah, Lydia prompted. Nolan hesitated, searching for the right words. She's different. Real. She makes me feel like I can just be myself, not the image of Nolan Everhart everyone expects. Lydia nodded thoughtfully. So what's the real question here? Is it about them, or is it about you? Nolan looked at her, confused. What do you mean? You've spent your entire life trying to live up to some ideal, Lydia said, her tone gentle but firm. Success, wealth, power. It's all been about proving something. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself what you actually want? The question hit him like a thunderclap, reverberating through his chest. For so long, he had been chasing an idea of happiness that felt more like a performance. But now, standing on the precipice of something real, he was terrified to take the leap. What if I make the wrong choice? Nolan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The heart doesn't lie if you listen to it, Lydia said simply. The real question is whether you have the courage to follow it. The next morning, Nolan stood outside Savannah's cafe. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet street. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle, before finally stepping inside. Savannah was behind the counter, setting out fresh pastries for the morning rush. She looked up when she heard the door, her expression a mixture of surprise and guardedness. Nolan, she said, her voice soft. You're here early. I needed to see you, he said, his tone earnest. Can we talk? Savannah nodded, wiping her hands on a towel before leading him to a quiet corner of the cafe. Ivy was still asleep in the back room, the faint sound of her breathing a comforting backdrop. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Nolan began, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. About everything. About us. Savannah's brow furrowed, but she didn't interrupt. I don't want to live my life wondering what if, Nolan continued. What if I had fought harder? What if I had listened to my heart instead of my fears? And what I keep coming back to is you, Savannah. You and Ivy. You're what matters. Savannah's eyes widened, her expression softening. Nolan, Let me finish, he said gently. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've been caught up in my own head, trying to figure out what's right. But I see it now. You're what's right, and I don't want to lose you. Savannah looked down at her hands, her lips pressed together. It's not just about me, Nolan. It's about Ivy, too. I can't risk letting someone into her life who isn't sure about what they want. I am sure, Nolan said firmly. And I want you to know that I'm not just saying this. I'm ready to prove it, however long it takes. Savannah met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. That's a big promise, Nolan. I mean every word, he said, his voice steady. You and Ivy are worth it. For a long moment, the cafe was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then Savannah reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. I believe you, she said softly, but let's take it one step at a time. Nolan nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. One step at a time. Later that evening, Nolan called Celeste. The conversation was brief but decisive. I can't give you what you're looking for, he said, his tone firm but kind. And I think you know that. Celeste was silent for a moment before responding. I just wanted to make things right. Sometimes making things right means letting go, Nolan said. I hope you find what you're looking for, Celeste. As he hung up the phone, Nolan felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, he was choosing not out of obligation or fear, but out of love, and it felt right. The late afternoon sun bathed Charleston in a golden glow as Nolan walked down the familiar street toward Savannah's cafe. In his hand, he held a small velvet box, a symbol of everything he had come to realize in the past few months. His heart raced with a mix of excitement and nervousness, but his resolve was unwavering, Today, he would take the biggest step of his life. The cafe buzzed with its usual energy, the sound of steaming milk and cheerful conversation filling the air. Savannah was behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour as she helped a customer choose between muffins. When her eyes met Nolan's, her smile widened, and the sight of it sent a wave of warmth through him. "Hey, you," she said as he approached the counter. "You're here early." "Couldn't wait," Nolan replied with a grin. "Do you have a minute?" Savannah glanced around the cafe. It was bustling, but the team she'd trained so well handled the rush with ease. "I think I can steal a moment," she said, motioning for him to follow her to the small table in the corner they had unofficially claimed as their own. Nolan pulled out a chair for her before taking a seat. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "about everything that's happened, about you, Ivy, and what the future looks like." Savannah tilted her head, her expression soft but curious. "And what have you decided?" "That I don't want to spend another day without you in it," Nolan said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You've changed my life, Savannah. You've shown me what it means to truly live, to love without fear or conditions. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm all in." Savannah's eyes widened, her breath catching as Nolan slipped the small velvet box onto the table and opened it, revealing a simple but elegant engagement ring. "I know this might feel fast," Nolan continued, his tone earnest, "but I've never been more certain about anything in my life. Savannah Carter, will you marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The noise of the cafe faded into the background, and all Savannah could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at Nolan, her hand trembling slightly in his. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Nolan. I'll marry you." The cafe erupted in applause as customers and staff alike cheered, their joy filling the room. Ivy, who had been sitting at the counter coloring, ran over and threw her arms around Nolan, giggling with excitement. "Does this mean you're staying forever?" she asked innocently. Nolan smiled, scooping her up into his arms. "That's exactly what it means." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of joy and preparation. Savannah's Cafe became the hub of their new life together, a place where love and community intertwined. Nolan, no longer the guarded businessman, embraced the simplicity and beauty of the life Savannah had built. Declan Royce's downfall had restored Nolan's reputation, but the accolades no longer consumed him. Instead, he focused on the people who mattered most, Savannah and Ivy. Together, they navigated the challenges of blending their worlds, finding strength in each other. On a cool autumn evening, surrounded by friends and family, Nolan and Savannah exchanged vows in the courtyard behind the cafe. Twinkling lights hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the intimate ceremony. Ivy stood between them, holding their hands as they promised to build a life rooted in love, trust, and resilience. Later that night, as the last of the guests trickled out and the courtyard fell quiet, Nolan and Savannah sat together under the stars, their hands intertwined. "I never thought this woo for a moment," the world seemed to stop. The noise of the cafe faded into the background, and all Savannah could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at Nolan. Her hand trembled. "Be my life," Nolan said softly, his gaze fixed on Savannah. "Good or bad?" Savannah teased, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Better than I ever could have imagined," Nolan replied, his voice filled with sincerity. Savannah smiled, her heart full. "Me too." As they sat there, the future stretched out before them, uncertain yet filled with promise. And for the first time in a long while, Nolan felt at peace. He had fought for this love, this life, and it was worth every step of the journey. As the story concludes, we're left with powerful questions about love, trust, and the true measures of happiness. Nolan's journey reminds us that sometimes it's not about what we have, but who stands by us when everything else fades away. Through his doubts, heartbreak, and ultimately finding real connection, we're shown that love isn't about perfection or appearances. It's about resilience, authenticity, and unwavering commitment. What about you? Have you ever questioned someone's loyalty or felt torn between trust and doubt? How would you handle a situation like Nolan's? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so share your perspectives in the comments below. And if you found this story moving, thought-provoking, or just plain entertaining, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. There are so many more stories on the way, filled with twists, lessons, and moments that might just make you see life a little differently. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and we'll see you in the next story.